This is part 1 of the lecture on Chapter 2, Environmental Ethics, Economics, and Policy. One of the main questions in environmental conservation is how have our views on nature changed throughout time? So how have humans' views on nature changed throughout time? And how are these views shaped? Well, they're shaped by a bunch of factors. Living, cultural history, our religion, our political beliefs, our knowledge about the environment, all of these play a role in how our views on nature are formed. Connections between humans and the environment were probably obvious to hunters and gatherers, but as people began to move to the cities or people moved in from the farmlands, they became a little less detached with nature, so their views on nature changed. And so the pre-industrial views, so before pre-industrial views, a lot of people had an animism type view, which is, that living and non-living objects have a soul or spirit. And these were the common religions of the indigenous folks. So, if you killed something to eat it, you said a prayer over it. You used every part of the species that you killed for all sorts of reasons. You used, the hide for your teepee, and you used the meat, and then you used all sorts of things. But before that happened, you said a prayer, and you were connected to nature. The issue, once we moved away from animalism type religious, was that we moved towards monotheistic religions. And these monotheistic religions put God as in charge. So, for example, you'll hear people say, thank God that storm didn't hit us, when in reality it's nature. But we use the Bible as actually a lot of people use the Bible as a scientific source, which is not true, because it is a belief source. And so a lot of people, when you read the Bible, God's really in charge. So God's the one who dictates nature. And when we started to put our faith in monotheistic religions, especially in a man above nature, we started to lose touch with nature a little bit, because instead of saying nature did it, we say instead God did it. So there's a lot. Also, the domestication of plants and animals. So, we began to alter the ecosystem when we started to domesticate both plants and animals. So when we started to cross-pollinate corn species, etc., when we started to domesticate pigs, all of this sort of stuff made us a little bit less detached with nature. And these are just some images of paintings that show how much we used to be connected to nature, the reverence that people gave to nature, and now we kind of have lost that reverence. This is a wonderful Shinto worship area, and this actually shows you this beautiful piece here is the symbolization between sea and land. And so, that idea that we used to have symbols of nature, instead now we have symbols of man. And so all these things play a factor. And then once we domesticated plants and animals, we moved to more monotheistic religions, came new technologies. And when new technologies came, we tended to put more emphasis in science, which was actually a good thing. Now, transcendentalism was the push that we needed to go back towards nature again, was that as we started to become a little bit more detached from nature, we had a lot of writers who said, wait a minute, this is a big problem. We need to move back to nature again. And so this is when we started to really start realizing that we were becoming separate from nature. Now, there's a lot of wonderful research out there as to whether we're still part of nature or not. And it's really an interesting concept. What's the difference between a human dam and a dam that a beaver builds? So there's just lots of wonderful research out there and questions on this. This image shows you how people moved into the cities and they, changed their thought processes. So this image shows us how people moved away from the farms and into the cities where there were, fewer opportunities for people to connect with the natural world. And so, this is Walden Pond, and I'll talk a little bit about Thoreau. And he went into the woods. Thoreau was the ideal man for transcendentalism, and he was that idea that we need to move back to nature again. So he wrote books. Walden's Pond is a wonderful book where he talks about how we've been disconnected, and he went to go live in the woods where he just connected with nature. And so this is just exactly where Walden Pond is. And so, then came new terminologies in terms of environmental conservation. And one of the two biggest terms that came out of this time period after we moved to the industrial sort of revolution was conservation versus preservation. And in terms of this class, preservation means that parks and public lands should be preserved in wild nature in a pristine state, hands off, meaning that we leave public parks the way they are, we don't interfere. And so if you look up the definition of preservation, sometimes it encompasses historic buildings. As far as this class, we're talking about nature, so we're talking about hands off. Conservationist view should be used and managed sustainably to provide the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people. That term means utilitarian. So utilitarian means the greatest good benefit to the greatest amount of people. And this idea of conservation is that. But also conservation includes use now, don't save for the future, which is crazy. But that is the idea, which is use it for the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. And if that means that we should use forests now because it's going to help the greatest amount of people now, then that's what conservation means. And there's a lot of questions with utilitarianism. The World Cup's going on, and a really good example of this is where do we draw the line as to what utilitarian means? So for example, let's say the World Cup's on and there's a man in a room somewhere, and I don't know, he's in charge, I'm just making this up, but let's say he's in charge of the distribution of the World Cup worldwide. And let's just say there's 10 people in that room. And a ginormous crater crashes on that room. And if we remove that crater, those 10 people we could save those 10 people, but if we save those 10 people and remove the crater, we are going to have to halt play of the World Cup worldwide. What do you think people are going to do? They're going to be okay with those 10 people dying because the World Cup makes more money and it benefits more people than those 10 people in that room. And I know that's a really hard ideal, but that's actually the ideal of conservation, which makes it a little tough for environmentalists to really grasp hold of it. So this idea of conservation and preservation really came to a head during the Hetch-Hetchy Reservoir debate. And this happened in I would say probably in about 1905. So in the 1900s, the Sierra Club opposed the project of damming this reservoir to provide water for San Francisco. So they were going to dam this valley, this river, fill it up with water. It was going to become a reservoir, and then that water was going to be pumped to San Francisco. The preservationists, of course, did not want to dam this river. They fought against it, and the biggest fighter for that was John Muir. And so he was the president, and he really, really thought at the time, Teddy Roosevelt was the president, and he really thought at the time that, you know what, I'm going to win this battle. And there was lots of publications about it. And so in the very beginning, Teddy Roosevelt supported Muir to preserve that area not to be dammed. But what really happened after that was the fact that there was a huge fire in San Francisco, and at the time everything was built by wood. And because everything was built by wood at the time, there was not enough water to put the fire out. So guess what? After that happened, everyone changed their mind and decided to dam the river and flood the valley and provide water to San Francisco. So in the end, the conservationists won this battle. But the big problem is that from that point forward, it almost set the precedence that instead of preserving nature, we actually conserve it. So there was just lots and lots of back and forth, and you can see that this set the tone for the rest of the future in terms of that. This is a great photo of John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. Pinchot was on the other side, which was the conservation side. So you had John Muir and Pinchot going head to head with their conservation preservation ideal. This is what the valley used to look like of the Hetch-Hetchy. This was painted in 1866, and this is what it looks like today. This is where it was dammed. This river was dammed, and it caused the valley to flood, and this is what that same area looks like today. So you could see there's a huge difference in the change of landscape in order to provide resources to humans. We now, though, are into the modern era. era. And in the modern era, we have a lot of problems with environmental conservation. Number one, there's trends and there's always debate. Is that, is climate changing happening or is it not? And what happens is because there's a debate and the minute you put doubt into anything, people seem to not understand the importance of it. So should we or shouldn't we? And the minute, there's the fact that we're still debating climate change is a huge problem because most countries in the world have accepted climate change except for the United States. So we can't be the only ones who are wrong. I mean, we have to think about it. It's really huge. And a lot of times environmental issues are entwined in global politics, which makes it really difficult. So corrupt governments. And so what happens is we have to fix those corrupt governments first before we can get to the environmental problems. Or cultural issues. For example, women, right? So there's a huge gender inequality throughout the world. And that is that women are supposed to carry water. Women are supposed to do certain things. And until we solve those cultural issues, we can't move forward with some of the other issues that we have, like getting people running water. And so these problems are all entwined together, and it's really, really hard. So I want to talk a little bit about the different types of ethics that are out there. And this is what makes it a little difficult, is that environmental ethics fall into a little bit of a different category. In life, we kind of have these ethics. We either have a virtue ethic, a consequence-based ethic, or a duty-based ethic. And the virtue ethics means you're right if it's right if it's motivated by virtues, meaning, I should just do it because I should be kind to others. Consequence-based ethics mean that you do things because you know there's a consequence. So I won't steal from someone because I might go to jail. Okay? Duty-based ethics are the fact that there are these laws and you seem to follow them. So a lot of people who are in the military fit really well into duty-based ethics because this is my duty, this is what I'm meant to do, this is what I should do. So in life, we seem to follow one or multiple of these types of ethics. When it comes to environmental conservation, though, we seem to follow different ethics. We seem to think people either have intrinsic or instrumental value, which means nature either provides to us, and that's what we mean by instrumental value, means things are valued as a means to something else. So they provide an instrument to something else. Intrinsic value, on the other hand, means that everything has the same value. It has a value unto itself. So that would mean a tree has the same value as a human. And I know this sounds really odd and strange, but it is a really interesting concept. Tons of papers, again, that have been written and researched on this topic, which is, does nature have an intrinsic value, meaning a value unto itself? And so there's just a lot of back and forth about this. There's a lot of questions about whether bacteria should have the same value as a human, or how do we put a value on these things? If they're not an instrument to human, then do they have a value? Or is intrinsic value something that's made up because humans are the ones who made up words? Lots of questions about intrinsic value and whether nature does have intrinsic value or not. And is that value of the intrinsic value based upon when it's in an ecosystem, or if it has a value by itself, that it's not tied to an ecosystem? So a lot of people think if it has something and it provides something to an ecosystem, then it has instrumental value. But if it can function and have its own value by itself and can function without the ecosystem, maybe it has an intrinsic value. Lots of questions about this. So these are just which organisms do you assign intrinsic value to, and what is the basis for your decision? So this is a really good question here. Which of these would you provide intrinsic value to? A lot of people would just do it to right here to the mammal species, but in reality, a mosquito could have intrinsic value. We just don't know about it yet. So there's just lots of questions. I'm going to stop here for part 1, and I'm going to pick up with some of the other environmental ethics that we have in part 2 of this lecture.